The public is being sold a narrative of kinetic threats. Headlines detail the relevance of Israeli missile defense experience for U.S. planning. This is a strategic misdirection. The exorbitant kinetic cost of interceptors is a defense against a protocol that is already obsolete. It is a shield for the last war. The real vector is not in the sky, it is in the silence. The G20 was built to stabilize the world's economy, but has systemically failed on debt and inequality, creating the motive. For a nation facing a terminal solvency crisis, the mathematical incentive is not a conventional attack. The asymmetric protocol is to sever the data arteries of the global financial system, the undersea cables that carry 99% of all transcontinental data. This activates what RUSI analysts refer to as the blind Leviathan protocol. A superpower is not its military. It is its data flow, its financial transactions, its global coordination. By targeting submarine cables or blinding satellite networks, an economically desperate actor can achieve strategic paralysis against a global power for a statistically insignificant cost. You do not need to sink the carrier, you simply blind it. You do not bomb the stock exchange, you sever its connection to global liquidity. The weapon is not a missile, it is silence, and the G20's structural failure has already armed it. The motive is not ideology, it is insolvency. The G20 framework, engineered to stabilize the global economy, has failed on its core mandate of managing sovereign debt. This is not an opinion, it is the documented conclusion from outlets like The Conversation. This failure created a systemic environment where a nation's balance sheet becomes its primary vulnerability. The Ukraine war must be reframed through this lens. It is not a war of choice, but a kinetic response to a looming solvency crisis. CSIS analysis confirms this vector. For Moscow, the protracted conventional war became a catastrophic domestic liability. The kinetic cost, the price of tanks, munitions, and manpower exceeded any potential gain, creating a fatal drain on the state's liquidity. An unpopular war is a balance sheet poison pill. When the cost of conventional projection becomes unsustainable, the state is classified as strategically insolvent. It is cornered. This is where weakness forces the pivot. For an insolvent state, conventional de-escalation means accepting defeat and systemic collapse. Asymmetric escalation, however, offers a low-cost, high-leverage alternative. The threat of deploying unconventional or nuclear assets is infinitely cheaper than deploying another armored division. It resets the entire strategic equation. It is the only protocol available when a state is mathematically incentivized to choose radical survival over predictable bankruptcy. Russia's strategy is not an anomaly. It is the new blueprint. By weaponizing its own insolvency, it demonstrated to every other indebted nation that the nuclear tripwire is the ultimate equalizer against economic pressure. The G20's failure did not just create debt, it created a launch-on-warning protocol for any nation pushed to the financial brink. The kinetic cost curve has inverted. The entire blueprint for 20th century warfare is now obsolete. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, have quantified the new battlefield economics. A $5 million main battle tank, a capital-intensive asset, is now a systemic liability. It can be operationally destroyed by a single $500 FPV drone. The math is not a one-to-one exchange. It is a 10,000-to-1 leverage against conventional power. This is the protocol known as the democratization of violence. It describes the systemic shift where lethal, state-grade military capability becomes accessible to any group with an internet connection and a credit card. It decouples kinetic impact from national GDP. The barrier to entry for projecting force has collapsed to near zero, transforming geopolitics into a zero-sum game of attrition. For a nation facing a solvency crisis, engineered by the G20's documented failure to manage global debt, this isn't a tactical choice. It is a mathematical certainty. They cannot afford the tank. They can afford 10,000 drones. Economic desperation weaponizes their entire defense doctrine, forcing them into an asymmetric posture where escalation is the only financially viable protocol for survival. Sovereign insolvency is now a force multiplier. The global framework is not dissolving into chaos. It is being reconfigured into designated gray zones. These are not failed states. They are proxy laboratories where the kinetic cost of intervention is deliberately ambiguous. The G20's systemic failure on sovereign debt is the mechanism that creates the actors forced to operate within them. We are observing the activation of these zones in real time. Denmark's shoot first, ask later protocol over Greenland is not an outlier. It is the blueprint for how even stable nations will defend strategic assets in a post-G20 world. This is not diplomacy. It is a shift to a launch-on-warning posture. Simultaneously, as documented by Defense Industry Europe, the transfer of Israeli missile defense experience to the U.S. Golden Dome plan confirms the tactical response. The hardware for high-stakes escalation is being distributed. These gray zones are the designated arenas where nations, pushed into a solvency crisis, are mathematically incentivized to deploy asymmetric protocols as a survival strategy. They are the engineered tripwires for a new vector of conflict. The launch-on-warning protocol is not a policy of aggression. It is a mathematical function of survival. It dictates that a nation must launch its kinetic arsenal the moment enemy missiles are detected, before its own silos are neutralized. The entire protocol, however, is a liability hinged on one systemic vulnerability: the integrity of early warning data. Now introduce the fog of digital war. A sophisticated cyber attack vector does not need to launch a missile. It only needs to blind the command center's radar. The screens go black. The commander is now in a zero-sum bind. Is this a system failure or the electronic shadow of an incoming first strike? CSI's threat models confirm the protocol defaults to the worst-case scenario. Hesitation guarantees annihilation. Launching out of fear, a digital shoot first, ask later policy becomes the only solvent strategic option. The cyber attack is no longer a digital event. It is a systemic trigger for nuclear exchange. The failure of the G20 framework is not an error in policy. It is the activation of a new economic weapon system. The core metric is no longer GDP, but strategic solvency. As established by the conversation, the G20's inability to manage systemic debt has created a cohort of nations whose only path to survival is unconventional escalation. This incentivizes what RUSI analysts term asymmetric liability creation. A state facing insolvency has a mathematical imperative to create a crisis for its creditors. The goal is not victory, but leverage. It is a protocol designed to force a negotiation by demonstrating the capacity to inflict systemic pain at a non-attributable, subkinetic level. The shoot-first rhetoric from allies like Denmark over strategic assets like Greenland is not an outlier. It is a leading indicator. The old protocols are dead. The preparation for new threat vectors is already underway, evidenced by the U.S. Golden Dome plan leveraging Israeli missile defense experience. They are hardening for kinetic attacks, but the first shot will be economic. Calibration forecast. Within 12 months, expect a simultaneous, non-kinetic event targeting a Tier 1 economic choke point, the port of Long Beach or Rotterdam. This will manifest as a catastrophic, cascading failure of the automated crane and logistics software, coinciding with a deep-sea fiber optic cable cut several hundred miles offshore. Both will be attributed to a plausible accident and a critical software patch failure. The dual event structure is the signal, a calibration shot to test Western response protocols to a solvency crisis being weaponized. It will be impossible to attribute, but the message will be received. It is the first launch-on warning signal of the new economic Cold War.